In the second part of this module, I wanted to introduce the developer tool. I understand that if you're coming from a Power Center background, that there's differences in the developer tool and Power Center. And what I'm going to try and do here is it'll actually give you a more overview of the developer tool versus doing a comparison with the Power Center client tools itself, right? So again, this is a quick overview of the Informatica developer tool. We'll do kind of walk faster here, but we'll do a overview of the developer tool. I'll talk about the new functionality of converting SQL to mapping, and I have a demo here that I can show you what the SQL to mapping has, and we have a lab activity that's that would be part of this, where you could actually take an ANSI SQL, or you can write up an ANSI SQL and build out a mapping from that ANSI SQL. And then we have this PC reuse report. What this PC reuse report is basically we have a huge Power Center customer base, right? And they're moving to big data, to the big data world. Now, most of these customers that I've talked to, they've got repositories, 5-6 different production repositories. They've got 50,000 different objects, workflows, mappings, and they use Power Center religiously in the environment, right? And they've architected their solution for data warehousing, data migration around Power Center, and they want to reuse some of the components from Power Center to in context of big data management. So what we've released is this PC reuse report, and the idea is that we want to analyze what's in your Power Center repository, be able to identify what objects can run directly on Hadoop without any changes, what mappings that would need some changes, and what mappings would need read writes, right? So 3 different categories of how you can reuse Power Center mappings in context of big data, right? So again, what you should be able to do is be able to describe what the developer tool is, navigate through the developer tool. That's very important because you will be using the developer tool for development, right? And understand the developer features, right? Developer specific features such as SQL to mapping and PC reuse report. I have a couple of slides before I'll actually walk through the developer tool of what the developer tool is, right? So developer tool is a GUI Eclipse based tool where I would develop mappings, profiles, create connections, create sources, maplets, and create data quality rules within this developer tool, right? So it's a very I would consider a much more advanced tool than Power Center, because it allows you to do a lot more development, a lot more transformations in this tool. And this tool is designed that when I build a mapping, it's going to be running on the Hadoop cluster, right? So it uses the framework for processing data on the Hadoop cluster. In terms of concepts, right? There's not a lot of difference between coming from Power Center and developer tool. Now there's differences in terms of there's no workflow monitor. How do you monitor your job? How do you design your workflows? There's a little bit intricacies between that, but if I were looking at a very maybe 1,000-foot level, I wouldn't see any difference, right? Because the transformations are the same, the transformation logic that I implement is the same, the functions that we have transforming that data is the same, right? What the developer tool you again use is to design big data mappings, right? How would you start the developer tool? Again, straightforward. This is in your program, so when you go to Start Programs, go to Informatica folder, you'll see a developer client, execute the developer, the icon, and you would bring up the developer tool. there's some useful stuff here. Tutorials. So if you want to learn more about navigating the developer tool, learn more about how to use the developer tool, take a look at the tutorials. It covers the basics. It doesn't cover how you process this data on Hadoop, but it gives you the basics of what the developer tool can do. In addition to the tutorials, it also has cheat sheets, and this is pretty handy if you're looking for something that you want to build out of there pretty quickly. Like examples here would be find duplicate records. How do I do that? How do I develop a workflow? You have cheat sheets that pop up and that can tell you step by step how you would build out these artifacts, right? Connecting to the model repository, right? So remember, like I said, when you work with the model repository, when you're working in context of big data management, you would use the developer tool to connect to the repository. So you connect to the repository using the developer tool. It has folders. It'll show you the folders, the project folders, subfolders. It'll have objects that you would have created, or if your teammate has created. On the left hand side, you'll see like an object explorer. Again, like I said, you'll see all the objects that you've created, or if you're in a shared environment, what your colleagues, what your teammates have created. Project is basically a top level container that you would store that you use to store folders, objects within the developer tool. And it goes down to best practices, right? If you have multiple projects, right? So say I've got data warehousing optimization, I've got a managed data lake, I've got a marketing data lake, I've got a healthcare data lake. You may want to consider these as a top level project containers, and then within them they'll have subfolders where you would store your data objects, you would store your mappings, your profiles, your workflows, and your applications that would run these workflows. Folders, just a good way to organize it. This is slightly different in terms of how shared objects work. I won't go through here shared folders, how it would work with Power Center, but you can definitely read up on how that would how you could set up shared folders within the environment, right? Well, let's talk about SQL to mapping converter, right? So we see this quite a bit, and as a practitioner, and I've seen this because I've done a lot of Power Center development and obviously a lot of big data development. When you go to a customer site, what do your analysts know how to use a SQL? So typically, I'll give you a quick story here, right? So I went to a customer site and we're doing a Power Center assessment, right? This is pre-big data, and what they had was this huge SQL statement, and the analyst did some analysis, and the developer was supposed to take that SQL, break it out into a mapping, Power Center mapping, and let it run on the Informatica Power Center integration service. What the developer did, I don't know why he did this. He copied that entire SQL statement, and it was pretty complex. It had at least about 150 to 200 lines of SQL, and what he did was that he created a dummy mapping, right? Reading from a dummy source, doing nothing in the transformation level, and writing it to a dummy flat file. But what he did was that he overrode the SQL statement in the session, and he pasted it in the session, and he ran that mapping. When I looked at it, I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. Why did they break this up? Why didn't they just pull the mapping? So fast forward, we'll go back and we talk to this customer about big data, because they were interested about, hey, how do we do big data implementation? So we talked to them to the strategy, and I brought this up. I was like, hey, do you remember this? Some time ago when I was out here, we were doing a Power Center review, and we came across this, and he said, yeah. Well, how do you resolve that? Because remember, in context of Hadoop doesn't understand SQL, right? The best practice is to take that SQL and obviously build out a mapping. Now the customer did an analysis, and they've had tons of these SQLs that weren't converted to mappings, where someone just went in and plopped them into a session or a SQL override and let them run. So what we did is that we took the SQL and we used the SQL to mapping converter that we released in 10.1 to give it a shot, right? And what it did is that it took that mapping, it parsed that, it took that SQL, it passed that SQL into a big data mapping, and it was big data ready, right? There's a few things that has limitations too within this. Remember, this is the first iteration of the converter tool, so there's a few things that are still being worked on. But at a high level, right, it took a select, it had a select, was able to build up the mapping. There was a insert, delete, and update, and it was able to convert the SQL to mapping. So we'll go ahead and I'll show you a quick demo here of the SQL to mapping conversion. But again, the idea is that it takes ANSI SQL compliant statements, and it'll convert that to a developer mapping. Remember, to a developer mapping, and it is support for select, insert, update, delete. If I go back one, and you'll see there's a few things that it doesn't support, right? Hierarchical queries, multi-table inserts, those are still not there yet within the converter, but I believe they may be it may come out in the next few versions, but again, I'm not 100% sure of what the roadmap is. But what it allows you to do is now you have the ability to say that, look, I have a big data mapping that's ready to execute on the Hadoop cluster because we've taken that ANSI SQL statement and converted it into BDM mapping. This is one question that did come up is, can I use hive QL? Hive QL isn't ANSI compliant, right? So ANSI compliant is usually your relational databases, Oracle DB2, SQL Server. Those are typically your ANSI SQL compliant statements that run on these databases. Hive isn't ANSI SQL. So there's no way that you could take a massive Hive QL, and I know I've seen customers do this, is again create a very complex Hive QL and try and convert that to a mapping. So this does not yet support that, right? It only supports ANSI SQL. In terms of PC reuse, again, the idea is that you wanted to generate a report that identifies power center mappings that can be run on the Hadoop cluster, right? And what this report does, it builds it out into 3 different categories, right? If I take this mapping, right, first category, if I take a mapping, will it run on the Hadoop cluster? If it doesn't run on the Hadoop cluster, what changes do I need to do to make that mapping run on the cluster? So that's the second use case. The third one is, okay, this mapping is not going to run on the Hadoop cluster, and it requires me to reconfigure this mapping or do something with the mapping to make it execute on the Hadoop platform. Well, let's do this. Let me go back to my developer environment. Okay, so where is it? Okay, so here I have my developer tool, right? So Windows. So this is only a Windows-based client. It does not support Mac right now, right? So I connect to my repository, and typically the way I connect to my repository is obviously if this was not configured, I configure my domain. Remember, my domain is going to tell me where my repository resides and what port number it's hosted on, and I can select what my repository service is, right? So remember, repository service is what you'd connect to. You never connect to the repository database itself, right? So I can select what repositories I want to connect to, and then when I connect to my environment, it's pretty much connect and ask for a username and password. I've logged on to the administrator. Using the administrator, typically you wouldn't have access to the administrator, your administrator would set up user accounts for you. This is the Object Explorer window, right? So you can see I have multiple projects that I've created that I'm working on. And each of these projects would have data objects being your source and target. Slightly different from what Power Center has, where it differentiates what a source object is and what a target object is. Here, your data object is your source and your target, and at times, you can use it for lookups. So here you can see, if I expand the node, you can see these are all my physical data objects that I have. At the top here, I've got my Hive data objects that I created. We'll cover parameters as well in depth in the next few modules. We've got my transformations that I've created, and I've got my mappings, right? And then I can have different types of objects, workflows also set up, maplets set up. So if I go back and look at, create new, so these are all the different objects that I can create within my within a folder, right? So transformations, we know how we're going to move the data. We've got mappings, maplets, parameter sets. I can set up profiles as well. So, and this is what we call a mapping canvas. So if I expand, maximize this, right? So this is my mapping canvas. This is where I'm going to build up my mappings. Again, you'll have a lab that will allow you to go in and build mappings, add some transformation logic, and then I have different properties here. I can have preview. One thing that is pretty cool, if you're comparing with Power Center, is like, how do I actually debug my mappings? What you have the ability to do is actually preview data as it flows from your source to the target. So at each step, I have the ability to preview my data. So it's one way of debugging what the data looks like, right? When you're going from one transformation to another transformation. We'll talk about the different properties. We'll talk about runtime when we actually set up connections to the Hadoop cluster. Again, help. It's got a pretty good help guide, cheat sheets that I talked about. Setting up connections. You'll have, I believe, you'll have a lab that will set up a connection, right? So different types of connections. What are the common attributes? Hive pushdown, Blaze engine. We'll look at Spark as well. So you'll have a number of ways to work through this developer tool, right? So again, this is a developer tool that that you would use to build out artifacts such as mappings, maplets, profiles that will execute on the Hadoop cluster, and we'll go through that execution phase here in a bit. Okay, and let's take a look at a quick SQL to mapping demo. So let me bring up my notepad that has a complex, well, I would consider a semi-complex SQL statement that's joining on two tables, line item and part table, joining on part key as my join condition. I have a pretty, I wouldn't consider this a complex where clause, but this gives you an idea of the types of SQL that we can convert to a mapping. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this to my clipboard. And I'm going to bring up my Informatica developer tool. This is a tool that I use to build out my mappings, profiles that will run on a Hadoop cluster. So I'm going to open up my folder and click on mapping from SQL query. And here I can paste the query and you can scroll up and you can see that the SQL statement is there. I have the option to select the SQL from a file, and I'm going to validate the query, and this should come back as a valid query. Yes, it does. Click OK. I'm going to name the mapping itself, and I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. So what this is doing is that it is going to parse the SQL, find what the tables are, match the tables to what is in the database and what's in my repository, and I'm going to click on Finish. And what it's going to do is going to go ahead, parse it, and convert it into a Informatica big data mapping. So here you see I have the mapping. I've got the two tables, line item and part table. I have my joiner transformation. If I look at the join condition, and I notice that I am joining on the pod key. And I've got a filter transformation as well. Look at my filter condition. If I scroll down, and where we have that pretty complex where clause. And then I have my aggregator. I can look at my ports. Quick scroll down here. You can see that we're doing an aggregation, and I can write this out to a flat file or to a HDFS file, or I can write this out to a hive table. I can also set up my validation environments where I'll select native, the Hadoop connections, and I can set up a Hadoop connection if I'm going to use this mapping to run on the Hadoop cluster. Okay, so we just took a look at a SQL to mapping demo, right? So what we're going to do in the lab is kind of get you're familiar with the developer tool, right? So as part of the prereqs, there's a rec to kind of get used to the developer tool, but that didn't give you a hands-on component to it. What you'll do in this particular lab is you'll work with the developer tool, obviously connect to the repository, build out a simple mapping. There's an exercise there to do SQL to mapping. You'll add folders and get just the idea is for you to actually get used to what the developer tool looks like, because like I said, primarily you'll be working with the developer tool to do a lot of your big data development. To wrap up here, you should be able to describe the developer tool user interface. Should be be able to understand how the developer tool connects to the Informatica platform, be able to create folders, projects, artifacts, be able to describe new features, SQL to mapping, as well as PC reuse report.